legitimate duty to protect the wounded and sick would potentially make it lose its protected status. For example, if it is being used as a command and control center, if the opposition's command structure is using that second floor to direct operations, if there are weapons stored there, if it is being used for military briefings, any of those sorts of things would make it lose its, potentially make it lose its protected status, even though it's not actually conducting an attack, if you like. So I think that's very important to stress. The other thing that I wanted to stress is clearly it would only lose its protection after a warning and a time limit has elapsed and nothing has been done. But I think the last speaker mentioned that they felt in this case that it hadn't lost its protection because on the basis of what was known publicly, it was not being used for military operations. I think it's important to distinguish between what is known as a public fact and therefore might have been available to Amnesty International and what is known through military intelligence. And in this case, we don't know. We don't know what the military intelligence was. We don't know whether it was corroboration that it was being used for military purposes. So I think we always have to bear that in mind when making a judgment. But I mean, subject to what you want, I can speak later on perhaps on some of the targeting procedures and the process and the need for positive identification that it is being used for military purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, and I'm really glad that you mentioned the warning because it was my following question. So I think we can perhaps now talk about proportionality and precaution because everybody seems to be really interested in this particular question. So my first question is for the students' representative. Could anyone explain to us to what extent do the general principle of proportionality apply to attack against a hospital in the event that its protection has ceased? Or how does this principle work? And according to you and to the facts that were reported by Amnesty International, do you think that there was a violation of this principle in the present case? Who wants to take the floor? So, Leon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. This is not Leon, however, it's Lele Cheruto from the University of Nairobi. Under the principle of proportionality, to what extent that it applies to the current situation, Rule 14 of the Rule 14 of customary international humanitarian law states that launching an attack which would have an expected loss of civilian life or injury to civilians or to civilian objects or a combination of which would be excessive to the direct military advantage expected would be prohibited. So the same would apply to this case that even though the hospital were to lose its protection, the expected military advantage and the incidental civilian loss should be proportional. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to follow up on this and also on another point regarding the assessment of proportionality more concretely, and I will come back to Ken on this particular issue in a few minutes. But before that, I would like to ask a question, a technical question maybe, to Françoise and also to Alexander. In assessing proportionality, how do we consider expected incidental damages to military medical staff and objects? Do the parties to the conflict have to take into account expected incidental damages to military medical staff, transport, and objects in the proportionality assessment? Who wants to react on this? Maybe firstly Alexander and then Françoise. Alexander?
Thank you very much, Jamila, for this very interesting question indeed. I mean, it leads us actually back to some of the fundamental treaty texts, and notably to Additional Protocol 1, which also for our purposes constitutes customary international humanitarian law. And there you will only explicitly see that the excessive expected incidental civilian harm must be considered in relation to concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So at first sight, on the basis of that omission, you might somehow argue that military medical facilities, transports, or military medical personnel would not benefit from these principles of proportionality as well as the principle of precautions. However, we of course need to be simply aware, and this has been stressed, that you know, it would be counterintuitive to actually consider that also military medical personnel and objects are specifically protected. So this would imply that they would have some elevated level of protection from civilian objects or civilians. And then at the same time say that they would not benefit from the principle of proportionality and the principle of precautions. The second thing, and this has been repeatedly underlined today, this fundamental obligation to respect and protect both civilian and military medical personnel and objects, and to do that in all circumstances. So this suggests really a very stringent character of that obligation. So also on that basis it would be strange not to consider the principle of proportionality in this respect. And finally, also a number of states in their military manuals do explicitly say that the principles of proportionality and precautions also apply to specifically protected objects and persons, and also the leading ICRC and Butesow-Parch commentaries take that view. So on that basis, at least for us in the ICRC, it's quite clear that generally these military medical personnel, facilities and transports must also benefit, of course, from the principles of proportionality and precautions. Back to you, Jamila.
Thank you, Alexander, for your very clear answer, at least from the ICRC point of view. Now I would like to give the floor to Adriana, who wants to react on what was just said. Adriana, you have the floor.
Yes, I would like to talk about how these principles were respected or not in this case.
Okay, great.
Prima facie, it appears that this airstrike would have been an indiscriminated attack because of the potential number of incidental victims that an airstrike may cause in a city. As an alternative to this airstrike, the Yemeni armed forces should have considered a ground attack, which could have allowed them to target only the fighters not rendered out of combat. However, I want to highlight that at this point it is not possible with the information available to assess the compliance of these principles because it is necessary to obtain further information on. With respect to the proportionality requirements, what was the military objective that they were after and its importance for the overall military campaign? For example, if in the hospital was present a high-ranking member of the armed group, and also what type of aircraft was used to assess how accurate can it be. And with respect to the precautionary requirements, it is also important to know the surrounding circumstances to determine what additional measures were feasible at the time, such as the time and urgency constraints when they were planning and carrying out the military operations. Also, we need to know what precautionary measures took the Yemeni armed forces at the time, intelligence, surveillance, etc. And
Adriana?
finally, it is important to know the military capabilities of the Yemeni armed forces. I also would like to highlight that it's important to take into account that since this airstrike was directed to an object located in a city, which is by definition a densely populated area, there is a higher threshold on what reasonable precautionary measures are expected because of the effects that an attack might produce for the civilian population. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. I think we already moved to the precaution topic with your answer. But before that, I really would like to hear Ken on the principle of proportionality, and then we will go back to precautions. But Ken, could you provide us maybe with examples from your practice on what are the concrete difficulties in assessing proportionality regarding attacks on hospital?
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. It's a really interesting question, and some great points have been raised actually in the discussion. Clearly, the first thing you're into is assessing, as somebody said, whether it's militarily necessary to achieve your mission to strike that hospital which has now lost its protected status. The proportionality assessment is extremely hard, and there is no simple equation to do that. You have to factor in a number of things. You have to factor in the value of the target. Somebody's mentioned it's a high-ranking leader, perhaps. That would then become an HVT, a high-value target. You must look at the locations of civilians in the surrounding area and other protected individuals. And then you need to do a predicted battle damage assessment. In other words, how much incidental damage are you going to cause, dependent on the means and methods which you use to strike. And that is not an easy equation to do, and it must be done on the basis of the intelligence that the military has available to it at the time, and we very often tend to judge after the fact when everything is known and clear. Just in terms of means and methods in respect to proportionality, though, a couple of quick comments. Airstrike. Airstrike is actually a relatively precise means of hitting a target, much more precise, for example, than artillery, which is clearly an area weapon. It's not a point weapon. You can't hit a point target with it. And actually ground attack, be very careful when one recommends this. Ground attack is usually very costly in terms of casualties. It involves fighting your way into an area and into an objective, and I suspect the casualties in the surrounding area might have been much higher had that taken place. Finally, on the sort of airstrikes means and methods, clearly angle, timing of attack are all factors which you can use in your proportionality assessment, and indeed as a means of precaution, the other key principle here in further reducing civilian casualties. You can adjust the warhead on a sophisticated weapon used for airstrike to mean that actually the explosion will only affect one level of a particular building. You can increase it to mean it will take 2 levels, or a full charge, if you like, that it will take the whole building down. But I think, as somebody said very rightly, it depends on the military capability of the armed forces concerned. And in this particular case, clearly, I doubt that was available to the Yemenis. So that's not an excuse to avoid the obligations, which are absolute, but we must take this into account when we're assessing their conduct. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. I think we've, as I said before, already moved to the precaution principle. I know that I see that some people want to react on what have just been said. I will give the floor first to Rita and then to Camille. So Rita, you have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to point out that in the facts that the case has given us, there were civilians being taken care in the first floor. Therefore, I think this has, even if the armed group had the control of the second floor, this was a point that had to be taken care of in the assessment of the principle of precaution. I think also that an airstrike can, and taking in consideration that the military capabilities of the Yemeni armed forces can be more destructive and more damaging to the civilians that were being attended in the first floor, and also international humanitarian law establishes the obligation to do everything feasible to assess whether the attack may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects, or a combination of them. So I think that with the facts that we have in the case, and since we do not have the information, the intelligence information that the military have, I think that it can be described as that it did not take in consideration correctly the principle of precaution. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, no, Camille, do you have something to add on this?
Yes, I do. So I would like to recall that there is an obligation on both sides to an armed conflict to protect medical units, wounded and sick, and medical personnel. So under precautions, there are also passive precautions. The medical authorities in particular have an obligation to make sure the hospital is used solely for medical purposes. Additionally, an active precaution made by the attackers, as my colleague from the Geneva Academy said, there's also they also have to get as much information as possible before to attack, to know in particular if the activity carried out by the armed group in the hospital are hostile acts or not.
Thank you, Camille. So we are almost running out of time, but on those two questions of proportionality and precautions, I would like to hear maybe what Alexander has to say about what was said by Ken Hume and by the various students, and then we will already have to wrap up. So Alexander, you have a few minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Jamila. And I think Ken already put it much better in military terms than I could ever put it. But I think one aspect to be underlined, and what makes really finding evaluation of proportionality so difficult, is actually the kind of